I am 63 years old, and I do something every morning before the day gets its hands on me that takes 5 minutes and costs nothing. I started doing it about 2 years ago, and in those 2 years, I have not had a single night where my body failed me the way it had been failing me for years. I don't say that to impress you. I say it because when I was in the middle of what I was going through, I would have paid a great deal to hear a man my age say exactly that, and mean it. Not as a sales pitch, not as the kind of story you hear and immediately recognize as too clean to be true. Just a man, same age as me, telling me what actually happened. If something has been going wrong for you in this area, if the body has been unreliable in ways that make you feel like a stranger in your own skin, stay with me until the end. What changed everything for me is not what I expected. And it took longer to find than it should have, because the one place I trusted to give me answers gave me something far worse than nothing. It gave me an explanation that closed every door. I know what it feels like to sit across from someone in a white coat and leave more defeated than when you walked in. I've been there, exactly there, and what I found came later, not from that office and not from where you'd expect. Stay until the end. The moment I understood something permanent had happened, I was standing in the bathroom at 6:15 in the morning. Not a dramatic moment. My wife was still asleep. The house was quiet. I was going through the motions of getting ready, the kind of automatic routine that bodies carry out before the mind has fully arrived. And I noticed something in the mirror that I had been very deliberately not noticing for months. I looked depleted, not tired from a bad night. Depleted in the way that happens when something deeper has been draining for a long time. My face had a flatness to it, a quality I recognized, not as age, because I'd known plenty of men older than me who didn't have it. Something else, like a pilot light that had gone very low. That was the morning I stopped pretending it was a phase. The nights leading up to that had been building in a way I'd managed to explain away, one at a time. Once was nothing. Stress. A long week. Something I ate. Twice was a coincidence. 3 times was a pattern I didn't want to name. By the time that morning came, I had been quietly constructing explanations for long enough that the effort of constructing them had become exhausting. My wife had said nothing. That was the part that stayed with me. She had been adjusting around me with a gentleness that was worse than any accusation could have been. We had been together long enough for her to know when to say nothing, and that silence had its own weight. I made an appointment with my doctor. I told him what was happening, more plainly than I expected to, and he listened with the particular look of someone who has heard this many times and has already decided what to say before the patient finishes speaking. He ran some tests, called me back in 2 weeks, sat across from me and said my testosterone was in the low normal range, that for my age this was to be expected, that some decline was natural, that there were medications available if I wanted to explore that route, and that I should think about stress management. I left his office with a brochure. A brochure. I sat in my car for a long time. What he had given me wasn't a diagnosis. It was a category. He had placed me into a category called men your age and handed me a piece of paper. And something about that, the finality of it, the way he'd said low normal range like it closed the conversation, settled into me like a stone. I drove home believing he was right, that this was what getting older looked like, that I had crossed some threshold, and the man I had been before, it was simply no longer available. I lived with that for the better part of a year. The thing that broke it wasn't a person. It was an evening. I had been sitting alone on the small terrace behind my house, the kind of evening that feels suspended, where the light goes a particular color and everything gets very still. My wife had gone in early. I was out there with nothing to do and no reason to avoid my own thoughts. And something shifted, not dramatically, more like a pressure I'd been leaning against finally leaned back. I had been telling myself for a year that what the doctor said was true, that my body was in a new category, that normal for my age meant something less than what I used to be. And sitting there in the quiet, I suddenly found that I didn't actually believe it. I had accepted it, but I hadn't believed it. There's a difference, and that evening I finally felt the difference. Something in me decided it was worth finding out if the doctor had been wrong. I want to stop here because this is the moment where, if I am being honest with you, I almost lost myself again. For a long time, and I mean a long time, most of the year I'd spent accepting that diagnosis. I had considered things other than what the doctor had offered. Natural things, supplements, combinations of roots and plants and extracts that people mentioned in passing. And I had dismissed every one of them, not because I was convinced they didn't work, because I had been convinced there was nothing to fix. The doctor's category had made me give up the problem, not just the hope for a solution. That evening, sitting in that light, I started looking again. Not desperately, that frantic searching I'd done in the early months before the appointment. More carefully, more willing to take seriously what I had previously filed away as wishful thinking. What I found, and what I started using a few weeks later, I had actually encountered before, once, briefly, and set aside. An antioxidant that works specifically on the blood vessels, not in a general sense, in the specific sense of the small blood vessels, the ones in places where blood flow matters in very particular ways. I'd read about it and moved on, because I had convinced myself there was nothing to treat. Now I read the same thing, and it landed differently. The second thing I came across alongside it was tribulus, a plant extract I was skeptical of at first. But I read more carefully than I had before, and what it does isn't complicated. It signals the body to resume producing what it had been producing less of. Not a substitute, a prompt. A reminder to a system that had gotten quiet. I wasn't expecting anything. That's the truth of it. I had been burned by expectation often enough that I had stopped expecting, which meant that what happened around 3 weeks in registered differently than it would have if I'd been waiting for it. One morning, an unremarkable morning, the kind where you're moving through the routine without thinking. I noticed something that I hadn't noticed in years. A physical readiness, not a signal, not a response to anything, just the body, doing what it used to do, as if it had remembered something. I stood there for a moment. I didn't trust it. I thought, one morning, then it happened again, then again, and by the 4th or 5th time, I stopped calling it a coincidence and started calling it a change. The link to what I found is in the description if you want to look at it. I put it there for whoever is at the same point I was. Not desperate, not hopeful, just willing to take one more look. It's there if you want it. But that was only part of what changed things. Let me tell you what else made the difference. Because the physical practice I mentioned, the 5 minutes every morning, is the part that made everything else work better. The first thing I started doing was something so simple that I dismissed it 3 separate times before I actually tried it. A brief movement practice in the morning, not exercise in the gym sense, not cardiovascular training. Something more targeted. Movements that activate the muscles of the pelvic floor and the deep muscles of the lower abdomen, held and released, combined with controlled breathing. I found it by accident, reading about circulation in men past 50. The mechanism behind it is not mysterious once you understand it. The blood vessels that supply the pelvic region respond to muscular activation the same way any vessel responds to the muscles around it. When those muscles are engaged and released rhythmically, blood moves through them more efficiently. A University of West England study followed men who practiced this kind of targeted pelvic work 3 times per week and found that more than 40% of them recovered normal erectile function without any other intervention, while the group using medication without the practice showed less durable results. The common mistake men make with this is treating it like an exercise, something to push through with effort. It works the opposite way. The effectiveness is in the conscious release, not the contraction. Holding is easy, letting go completely, feeling the tissue return to full relaxation before the next cycle. That is the part that most men skip. And it is the only part that matters. What I do? 5 minutes every morning before I get out of bed. 10 slow cycles of contraction, held for 3 seconds, released completely for 5. Breathing out on the hold. Breathing in on the release. No tools, no equipment, no schedule to maintain after the first 2 weeks, because it becomes as automatic as anything else the body learns. I noticed the difference in the first week. Not dramatically, but the vessels that had been carrying less than they should had a different quality to them, a responsiveness I had stopped expecting. Here, before I go further, if what I'm sharing sounds familiar to something you've been through or something you've been looking for, do me a favor. Like this video and subscribe to the channel, not for me personally, because the algorithm only shows this to other men who need to hear it if enough of the right men tell it something worth paying attention to. I can keep making these if I know they're reaching someone. That's the only reason I'm here. The second thing I changed was how I handled the first 30 minutes after waking. Not what I ate, not coffee or no coffee. How long I spent horizontal before standing up. I had spent years moving from sleep directly to standing, directly to obligation. The body doesn't prefer this. There's a transitional period, 10, 15 minutes at most, during which the vascular system recalibrates to upright circulation. If you cut that short, you're asking the body to skip a step it has reasons to take. What I do now, I don't rush the first moments of the morning. I do my pelvic practice while still lying down. I breathe. I let the body arrive at waking on its own terms before I ask it to function. A researcher at a sleep institute in Lausanne spent years studying morning cortisol curves in men past 50 and found that the first 30 minutes after waking contain what he called the cortisol awakening response, a natural hormonal surge that, if interrupted by immediate stress or rapid physical demands, produces a flattened testosterone curve for the rest of the day. The mistake most men make, treating waking as an alarm to respond to rather than a process to allow. Concrete instruction: do nothing demanding for the first 15 minutes after you open your eyes. No phone, no noise, no immediate obligation. Lie still. Let the awakening response complete. What follows that 15 minutes will be different from what would have followed without it. The third thing was more difficult for me to accept than the physical practices, because it required changing something I had held in a fixed position for years. My relationship with stillness during the day. I had spent most of my working life in motion. When I wasn't in motion, I was uncomfortable. Stillness felt like stopping, like giving up ground. And the body, as it turns out, had been paying for that, steadily, quietly, in ways that don't show up immediately. Chronic low-grade tension, the kind that doesn't feel like stress because it never rises to the level of an event, does something specific to hormonal production. Cortisol, the compound the body releases under sustained low-intensity pressure, competes with testosterone for the same raw materials. When cortisol stays elevated across a full day, not in spikes but as a baseline, the body quietly diverts resources away from testosterone production. There is no dramatic symptom, just a slow downward adjustment that accumulates over months and years until one day you're being placed into a category by a doctor who is reading numbers without knowing what produced them. Researchers at a university in the Netherlands tracked cortisol and testosterone patterns in working men past 50 over 18 months and found that the men with the highest sustained cortisol through midday, not morning peaks, sustained midday levels, showed the most significant decline in free testosterone regardless of age, weight, or physical activity level. The instruction is specific: 1 deliberate interruption per day between noon and 2 in the afternoon. Not meditation, not any system. A stop. Sitting for 10 minutes without a task, without a screen, without a reason. Just the body, allowed to do nothing for 10 minutes. The first time I tried this, I lasted 4 minutes before reaching for something to do. The second time, I lasted 6. By the second week, it had stopped feeling like failure and started feeling like something I had been missing without knowing it was absent. What the body does in those 10 minutes cannot be replicated by sleep, by exercise, or by anything done with intention. It is specifically the absence of intention that produces it. The cortisol that had been steady since morning drops. The signal to produce testosterone, quiet since breakfast, has space to resume. The fourth thing requires no change to any habit. It only requires not doing something you're probably already doing every evening. The hour before sleep is, from a hormonal standpoint, among the most sensitive periods of the day. The body is preparing for the window, the deep sleep hours, roughly between midnight and 4 in the morning, when testosterone production happens at its peak. If that window is disrupted, the production doesn't shift to another time. It simply doesn't happen at the same level. What disrupts it most reliably is light, specifically the blue wavelength that screens emit. The mechanism is not about attention or mental stimulation. It's about melatonin, which the body begins producing as light fades. Melatonin doesn't just govern sleep. It serves as a trigger for the hormonal sequence that begins deep sleep and testosterone production. Blue light suppresses melatonin with a precision that makes the body think the sun hasn't gone down yet. A research group in Sweden studied men between 50 and 65 who eliminated screens in the last hour before sleep for 12 weeks. Average free testosterone increased by 11% without any other change. Not total testosterone. Free testosterone, the fraction the body actually uses. The fraction that determines how you feel, how you respond, how you recover. The instruction: nothing with a screen after 9 in the evening. Paper, conversation, darkness, any of these will do. The body will do the rest if you stop interrupting it. I am 63 years old. I live in a quiet place with a small terrace and a woman I've been with for a long time. I wake up early and do 5 minutes that I don't have to think about anymore, and the mornings feel like mine in a way they hadn't for a long time. The thesis of everything I've shared today is simple. The body does not fail on a fixed schedule. It drifts, and the drift can be interrupted, not reversed in the way marketing language suggests. Interrupted, which is enough if you start before the drift has gone too far. Write in the comments. Is there something you've already tried that almost worked? Something that got close but didn't finish the job? I'm curious. More men than you'd think end up in that exact place, and there's usually a reason something didn't complete what it started. There is something I need to say plainly before I go, because I spent a year not saying it to myself. The vessels that carry blood to the places where blood needs to go in a man are not indifferent to time. They have a property, a flexibility, a responsiveness that changes depending on when you choose to address them. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, over years, the window in which those vessels respond most readily to change narrows. I nearly reached the edge of mine without knowing it was there. The doctor I saw didn't mention it because he had already written the category on my chart and moved on. But it was true. What sitting still looks like, month after month, is not neutrality. It is the quiet cost of distance. More mornings moving past each other without connection. More years of being a smaller version of the man you know you still are somewhere behind the surface. What I shared in this video and what I found in the description belong together. The habits give the body its conditions. What's in the link gives the body its materials. Neither one is the whole answer by itself. The link is in the description and pinned in the comments. Go there, read through it, and make your own call. No urgency, no deadline, just a man who nearly waited too long, telling you the door is still there. The only thing that separates the men who turned it around from the ones who didn't was one decision. Not the right supplement, not the right exercise. The decision to take the problem seriously one more time, even after they'd already been told not to bother.